Hello, everyone. Merry Christmas season and Happy New Year. Matthew here from True Restoration, and I'm joined by my brother, Alexander Arthur, who, if you've met him, you also know for some reason we call him Chana. So, Chana, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Matt. Appreciate the invite and consideration.
Yeah, no worries. Alrighty, so we'll jump into it. So this show is talking about the Borgias and the real truth behind it. Of course, we're always lay people with opinions and all that kind of good stuff. But Chana is much more well versed in history and things like that. So, Chana, I'll kick it off to you. So go for it.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting topic. History in general, I think, is an interesting topic, which has been almost sidelined, especially in modern education. As you find a lot of people who, when you're talking about what goes on, what they study in school, normally a lot of them don't actually like history very much because it's quote unquote boring, which the way it is taught, I think a lot of ways is boring actually. So lots of people generally find these things to be a bit of a slog or uninteresting or unimportant is actually a bigger one. But I'll get into the actual book itself just so that we, otherwise we'll be talking about everything else. So the book itself is called The Borgias. I'll show it here. Oh, it's all mirrored. The Borgias. Actually, maybe I shouldn't show that because he's not paying me. So it's called The Borgias, and I guess, subtitle is The Hidden History.
Do you mind just showing the cover again? I think it wasn't just so people can see it on screen for a little bit. There you go.
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
So
Thanks.
It's written by G.J. Meyer. I'm actually not 100% certain what his first name is, but that'll get you there. So a bit of background on the author himself. He has written a couple of books. This wasn't his first, but very specifically, his first book, I think, was called The Tudors, the complete story of England's most notorious dynasty. So the Tudors were the English dynasty, reasonably short-lived. I think off the top of my head, it was so Henry VIII, his father, I think, ascended the throne, and then it passed through basically three of Henry VIII's children. He never had any grandchildren who could take over. And that was the Protestant turning point in English history. So the Tudors were they were absolutely a very important, as in important, influentially in history, dynasty in the English kingdoms. But so he wrote a book about the Tudors, and it was very specifically from the perspective of, okay, I'm going to go into this. Most people know about them. Most people have heard of them, as in people in the, I guess you'd say, community of being interested in history. But his perspective was, I want to go into it and do a deep dive. Everyone talks about all kinds of things. I'm going to see what's actually true, what's a little bit exaggerated, what's underplayed, what other mechanisms are going on. So that's what he did. I personally haven't read that book. I would like to at some point, but I think from I guess there's a little bit more of the sort of modern mentality is it's kind of a bit of a case of, well, I already don't much like them, so I don't really feel the need to go into it, but it would still be interesting. Just again,
so with the Tudors book, though, based on what you've seen, synopsis or whatever, did he basically dig up a lot of dirt? Like it was validated there was a lot of dirt on the Tudors.
Absolutely,
he exposed pretty well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he called it, England's most notorious dynasty. So that was his idea. So he carved himself a niche, so to speak. It was reasonably well received, as far as I'm aware. It caused a decent number of waves in in historical scholarship circles. Lots of English people didn't much like it. or he himself is English, by the way. That's actually an interesting note. As far as I'm aware, he himself is English. But yeah, so there were criticisms of it, as always there are. There's always, whenever anything gets published or written historically, there's going to be a divide. I think a lot of people don't know in the background of history. If someone writes anything, there will be historians who criticize it and say, "Oh, well, that's just stupid. That's ridiculous." Blah blah blah. For whatever reason, as well. That's another thing. Is there seems to be a big phenomenon of historians criticizing these sorts of things without doing anywhere near as much research as the person previously. But you know, in the lay world, everyone's an expert. In the expert world, everyone's even more of an expert. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so basically we have an author who not infallible, but seems like he does his digging. It seems like he does his research. He's written a book about the Tudors. He's dug up lots of dirt. It's even his own country, so from his own country. So he clearly has no qualms just actually being unbiased and digging the dirt. And now he's what was his next book about? The Borgias.
So the next,
we know about his approach
book,
now, so it's good to move on.
Yeah. So his specific approach was find something bad, make it, get the whole story. That was his niche. So it's interesting how he opens the book. So that's the niche he's carved for himself. That's his style. He opens the book with the introduction is called The Borgia Problem. And quote, "This is not the book I set out to write." So he's gone, I've done the Tudors, I'm going to the next most infamous dynasty in history, which is the Borgias, if you actually think about it. So my expectation at the start was simple, that by digging more deeply into the story of the Borgias than other writers appeared to have done, I might be able to put new flesh on that story's old bones. All the thrilling tales, etc., all of the bad stuff, that was end quote, thereby bringing the whole thing to life in more entertaining, possibly more meaningful ways. A year of research on both sides of the Atlantic did generate that new flesh, more fresh material than I had hoped, as the following pages will show. But I found something unforeseen as well, evidence that the Borgia story, when one pursues it far enough, turns out to be vastly different from what the world supposes, and vastly more interesting than I myself had imagined. And I'll just close on this line. I found myself confronted not only with new flesh, but new bones, an entirely new understanding of who the Borgias were and what they actually did. So he goes on to say that as he was writing the book, he was almost surprising himself with how it was taking shape.
And just to be clear for the audience, it sounds like he's basically set out thinking, I'm going to get so much dirt on this dynasty. This is going to be such a good expose. But now he's like, there's actually there's not as much dirt. It actually doesn't seem as bad as everyone made out to be.
But the interesting thing was, it seems like he managed to create for himself a whole other historical niche accidentally, which is I guess, I don't like to use the term revision for a number of reasons. There's a whole there's a class of historian which are criticized as like revisionist because they go against whatever the modern consensus is. It's very specifically actually used to refer to like World War II era propaganda and all that. So there's like revisionist historians who wrote about that. I don't like using the term for one, it has supposedly bad connotations, and two, basically all of history or historiography is a revision when you think about it. What you're writing, whenever people are looking into history, it should be from the case of, well, I'm revising the information. So everything's a revision. But he's managed to seemingly accidentally get himself into another very specific niche, which is the revising expose almost. So yeah, that's the situation he's found
That's
himself in.
interesting. Well, I think the audience is going to be wanting some meat. So I think that let's jump into some examples of what he's found, maybe some common beliefs about Borgias that are negative beliefs. They're not good. Let's jump into it.
Well, I think first of all, I'll set the I'll mention that this book is actually it's not suitable for children because that is a lot of the Borgia myth surrounds those sorts of things, and in obviously many cases him removing the bias or not bias, breaking down the narrative. He has to go into what the narrative actually is.
So maybe that's a good one. That's a good one. Just so we can actually keep this conversation a bit more interesting, maybe just for the audience, if you do have children, maybe close this down and you can just come back to it later or move them, just so we can actually keep the conversation flowing and actually get into the details. So
having said that,
audience, just a reminder, do what you need to do.
Having said that, in what I say, I'll try and be as what's the word, censored as possible while getting the point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I think an interesting thing is this is something he himself I don't think quite recognized, but it was very obvious from the Catholic perspective, and that is that there are things which happened in previous times of the church which have since been disallowed, if that makes sense. So they're not in practice anymore. They're not allowed anymore. But the problem is, if you say what happened now on the face of it, 500 years ago, which is I think a little bit before that, but 500 years ago, saying that happened, it actually sounds terrible without context. It sounds terrible and immoral and like very bad reflection on the papacy. Or not the papacy itself, but on the popes at the time. So first of all, the Borgias were a Spanish family. Their original name was Borja, from I think the Valencia region of Spain. So I'll try and get to some stories and not give like the full extent. But I think an important thing to set is that the Italians of the time were a vastly different culture, not like vastly, but themselves viewed themselves as a vastly different culture to basically the entire world. The more you read, especially from this book, but just in general, just the level of not to be offensive to people of Italian background, although this is 800 years ago, they were just racist, really, against.
Oh, your wife's got Italian background, so you can say what you want now.
Oh no, confirmed. Like whenever I bring this up, it gets confirmed. That's I'm not talking about now. But the idea is that in their minds, the legacy of the Roman Empire, which was the civilizing force of the world, they were the ones in Italy to inherit that. They would refer to other people as barbarians. So even Europeans. So what happens is there's a Pope elected, Pope Sixtus something, maybe the third, I don't remember his name. He was the first ever Borgia Pope. Now, he's never brought up in the Borgia narrative because he didn't do anything wrong. That's just the fact is that even in the modern narrative, he's not done anything wrong. So they don't mention him, people who criticize the Borgias. What he did do, which some people nowadays might raise their eyebrows at, was he appointed his nephew to be a cardinal. Now, there's a word for that. It's called nepotism. So again, looking back to contextualize what things were like back then, nepotism itself as a word comes from, I think, the Italian word nepo, which actually means nephew. So there's one thing he mentions at the time, which was, the expectations of a pope. There's a list of things. One of them is that he will not promote too many of his family members to positions of power. everyone knew that people were going to appoint family members. That's just how it worked. And I think one thing I've heard is that the difference between nepotism and just and not nepotism is people's capability. If you appoint, I come from a family business, so I'm kind of maybe a little bit biased, but if a person is appointed to a role that they are fit for, it doesn't class as nepotism. Arguably, that's sort of my perspective. So he appoints his nephew. His nephew is the one who becomes the infamous Pope Alexander the Sixth. He's the infamous Borgia Pope. Now, to get into the story around him, so one of the big overarching narratives is that this Pope not only had multiple children, but he appointed his children to positions of power in the church and gave them strong connections. So as Maya is going back in time, he is finding, okay, let's look at this. What historian gives that, and who does he cite? Perfect. He goes back, finds that historian, and this is actual historical analysis, is going back, following the sources to find the original. And as he goes further and further back, he hits a wall, which I think was maybe 200 years afterwards. And it's one quote. I don't remember the exact quote off the top of my head. I would have done. The problem is, I'll say this really quick. I actually haven't fully finished the book, and because I wasn't expecting to do a podcast, I wasn't putting tabs. So my quotes will be semi loose, but if any come up in particular, I'll see if I. I'll
Yeah,
see
so
if there is.
if you want to correct Chana's work, just get the book yourself.
Yeah,
and then,
if anyone has the book and you're reading it, feel free to. That's one thing in all this, is that people.
In fact, if anyone else
say the
has
wrong
read the
word.
book and wants to comment and say, "Hey, Alexander, you were wrong," and make my brother look like an idiot, I will be very, very grateful. Back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But so he hits a point in the historical lineage, which just ends, and it's someone who says, basically, Pope Alexander the Sixth, one of the most horrifically immoral people to have ever lived. Also, something about having many children, and appointed them to roles. That was the end of it. So he's like, well, this should go back to contemporary sources. That's actually the gold standard, is contemporary sources. And then once you find contemporary sources, then you start saying, well, what were their biases, that sort of thing. But he doesn't find it. It doesn't go back far enough. One thing which is interesting, I don't know if he mentions it. He might not have mentioned it yet. But again, to put church dynamics or European dynamics tied in with the church into context. So there was a phenomenon which was quite, not uncommon, I'll say. I won't say quite common, not uncommon, which was, because clergy, arguably in Europe at that time, had the most stable careers, so to speak, for lack of a better word. It's a bit crude, but they had the most stable lives and careers and the best connections. That was just how it worked. It was not uncommon for a widow or orphaned children to actually be put under the care of a clergyman, their uncle or such and such. It would be, and again, it wasn't like today where everyone's been swept into like the clergy have been swept into the wilderness and they're trying to make their own way. It was a vastly different world, even the secularization of the 1800s was so radical in the effect it had on the entire world and the structure of how the church functioned. It was ridiculous. But even then, I think this practice was done away with later on by church restrictions, because the church would restrict things not always because of immorality or abuse, but because of prudence. That was the big thing. Is now, looking back, some of these things, not this one, but some of these things can look like abuse, but they weren't at the time restricted for that. They were restricted out of prudence, and I would say for good reason very often. But so this would happen. A uncle would basically adopt. There was no word for adoption back then in the same way. There was no legal mechanism. It was just they'd be put under their care. And the interesting thing is they would refer to their the children under their care in very specific wording, and they would use them. They would refer to them in specific documents if they were trying to sponsor them for a job or to marry off a woman, like their niece. If they wanted to marry them, blah, blah, they wanted to give them connections. That was the big thing, is that if a widow was left with children, she could say, look, my husband had a brother who was a priest and is now a bishop. It's basically a gold mine for the children. They wouldn't take them unless there was an extreme circumstance, but it was an act of charity, which the role at the time could actually allow. There was like you couldn't even imagine a priest or bishop now having the time to do anything like this. But back then it was a whole other class of people.
It was kind of common practice, is what you're saying.
Well, acceptable practice. I don't know how common, but acceptable and completely fit within their role. But they would use a word or wordings to refer to them. And this did also happen with popes. It was known that a pope he might not have had them at the time, as in like he might not have, he might have been given them to his care before he was the pope, and then he'd become the pope. But what they would do is, because again, they would write things in Latin, official things were in Latin, they would say about this nephew who was under their care, they would refer to them as filius, filius, and in the case of a pope, filius, someone who knows Latin could get the actual phrasing, but the word directly translates to son of the Pope. Or they would do filii, which would be children of the Pope. That did not mean it was their child. That's the important.
So was that actually a misconception that happened? Is they thought that these popes were having all these children, but it was actually just a term for relatives that they were adopted under their care, essentially?
This is the double standard. Catholics knew that was the thing. There are loads of popes. Maybe nowadays, on the top of their head, English speaking might not know this, but they knew that was a practice. But when Pope Alexander VI, when he wrote Filius Patri, they said, "Oh, he's got a son. He said it." But if a different pope said it, it was like, "Oh no, that's adopted." It's like, well, what? Hang on. You've got to have everything in context. There was no word that they would specifically use which meant, my biological child. It wasn't a thing, so to speak, for the clergy to use. They would all refer to them as, in Latin, filius, filii, which more so meant spiritual child under my care, so to speak. So that's the thing, is that you have records of Pope Alexander VI using that phrase. So that's what people point to. So someone will look back and said, perfect, that's what we want. So that's the first example, is that's the first example of almost dishonest history, because again, this wasn't an accident. That's, I think, the important thing. Whenever there's something so outrageous, a story about someone, it's not an accident. It was based on someone or some people, maybe not even a conspiracy, so to speak, but if you have a number of people independently disliking someone and working together, it almost makes it look more believable because of that. And the problem is that the Borgia family made a lot of enemies in Italy and in Rome. And that's, I think, a very important thing to point out is, again, like I mentioned, the Borgias were Spanish. The the papal nations, so to speak, the ones who were argued to have a better claim to the papacy, were the Italians and the French. The French had actually, at this point, the Babylonian captivity, the popes of Avignon had only just come back. The Great Western Schism had only just ended. So he doesn't just start with the Borgias, he goes back a few popes to set the whole scene through their career. And he sets a lot of the tone about the papacy and about Rome at the time. Again, he's not a Catholic, so I would say you need to be aware that his theological phrasings don't his theological phrasings might not be, perfectly theologically sound, but it's the perspective of a modern secular historian who is just presenting the details, so to speak.
Cool. And I think one thing we haven't really done, which actually might be cool, even though we're 25 minutes in, but it might be good to just sum up for the audience. What are some common, I guess, myths or, theories about the Borgias that portray them negatively that they actually find out? You already debunked one, but maybe just good to sum up for the audience. I think that might be quite punchy.
Well, so first of all, there's that one. To be fair, in Catholic circles, that's almost the biggest one. The idea that a pope had children as a clergyman and then treated them with nepotism. That is actually quite outrageous. Although, one thing to point out is that the author does say, he does list, there's another pope at the time, I think just before Pope Alexander VI, who did actually have children, and that was recorded. He did have children, not as a pope. It was before he entered the clergy, but he was never married and he had children. So he points that out. So he says that that's the sort of thing that happened. But so there are whole stories of, I think one of the oh, I need to get this set right. One of the phrases is that he basically impoverished Rome by spending money on, wine, women, and song, that sort of thing, turned the Vatican into a complete party house, engaged in bribery to win his election. This is another example. Basically, the idea is that he was waiting his whole life to become the Pope, which is just never a good look when you think about it. It's to be expected.
Who was this? Sorry, I forgot which Borgia.
This was Pope Alexander VI. Rodrigo Borgia was his name. So Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, then elected Pope Alexander VI. So basically, he was hungry for power. He was having children left, right, and center. He was making them, in charge of the highest positions for no reason whatsoever, except they were his family. And then he plunged Rome and Italy into all kinds of terrible situations. There was another thing, just a random situation in I forget exactly what city it was. I'd have to read it. One of the north western Italian cities, where some preacher named Savonarola, that was his last name, Savonarola, was just going absolutely critical of Rome and him, and eventually got burned to death, I think. So, and then people were like, oh, he was killing people as well. So it's just all round bad. That's just the stories, is all round bad. But sort of the worst thing you could possibly want from a pope, basically. And again, it's hard to summarize because he goes through them one by one, so to speak. He's going through the timeline. He's not just sort of encapsulating everything and saying this is all the myths. It's a timeline. So it's hard to summarize and almost even harder to dismiss or debunk all at once. But again, for people to get the full context, they would have to read the book, and you won't really get the full context if you just try and research online. So unfortunately, it's hidden behind a paywall called buying a book. But yeah, I'll give a few specific stories. I think is probably more important, just to get people interested. And I also think it's not just about being interested in this, so to speak. There's an important, I would say, attitude of scrutiny that people, and especially Catholics, need to have about history. And this is a prime example because it also shows a lineage of how, or a process of the myths being made. So one thing, for instance, I'll just say another story which sounds outrageous without context. So Pope Alexander VI had a nephew who he appointed a cardinal, and his name was Cesare Borgia, Cardinal Cesare Borgia. He took the Italian name. So Cardinal Cesare Borgia is appointed when he's maybe 18 to a cardinal. At that point, Cardinal had different roles to now. They were electors, that's 100% true. That was their prime purpose, but they were the princes of the church. And they were arguably almost the officials and executives for the Pope. They were the Pope's almost personal, I guess, lieutenants almost. If he wanted a job done, if he wanted diplomacy done, if he wanted something managed, it would be Cardinal this, Cardinal that. They were the next step down. And that's, I think, important to keep in mind for the time. So he appoints Cardinal Cesare Borgia. This is he's quite young at this point. I think he hits maybe 20 or 21. And then the story goes, I'll quote this as tightly as I can. Cardinal Cesare Borgia woke up one day, prepared himself, put on his cardinal clothing, his hat, everything, and he goes out and he meets at a special meeting with all of the cardinals and the Pope that he had previously organized. And he says to them, I have decided that I no longer want to be a cardinal. I want to put away the cardinalcy and enter the lay world. Now, this sounds outrageous. What? A cardinal just entering the lay world? What? But the cardinals were there and the Pope was there, and they basically, this is much more loosely quoting now, they looked at each other and thought, well, there's actually no reason you can't, because he was not a priest yet. He was appointed a cardinal as a role, but because he was appointed too young, he had not received any orders. So that would be, I would say, impossible today. It's still technically allowed. But
Bishop Sanborn was asked this on a live stream about cardinals being separate to holy orders, and he said they're two separate things. You had cardinals in the early church that didn't have any orders; they were just electors. So
well, there you go. Bishop Sanborn supporting.
Yeah, I think this is actually I think this is a common thing that people don't understand the distinction about, and I guess that's being played on by whoever was wanting to portray these people as evil.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing is, so Cardinal Cesare Borgia, he says, I no longer want to be a cardinal. The phrase he uses is, I didn't choose the clerical life. I was put on this path when I was quite young. I was basically chosen from my family to study to be a priest, blah, 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 blah. I was doing the studies, and he said, I don't think it's meant for me. And if I was to become a cardinal, or if I was to stay a cardinal and become a priest, I would fear for my salvation. Basically, I don't think that's my vocation. So the cardinals say, well, we're not sure. They just say, we'll leave it up to the Pope. And Pope Alexander says, okay, you're done. You're not a cardinal anymore. hand in your hat and all the things, and that's it. You're dismissed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Cesare Borgia is the man who is the accused actual son of Pope Alexander VI. So if you tie that into the whole story of him being his actual son who he's been making cardinal, and then he's letting him go and do all this stuff, it sounds bad. But if you look at everything in the context of what it actually was, everything starts to make a little bit more sense. So he's relieved of the cardinalcy, and he actually gets married within a year. So, but just imagine that story around the dinner table. Oh yeah, the cardinal, the cardinal who was the son of the Pope, the filius, the cardinal who was the son of the Pope. He goes to the Pope and says, "Can I stop being a cardinal?" And the Pope says, "Yeah, sure." And then the cardinal's married within a year. What? Like, it just sounds bad.
But really, did you say it was a nephew of the Pope?
Yes, that was the idea.
So really, it's a nephew of the Pope. He
Yep.
was a cardinal, but never given holy orders. And the idea was you can stay cardinal as an elector, and you can study to be a priest and get holy orders if you
Yep.
that's
Or
what you decide. Then
yeah,
then the nephew decides, hey, this isn't my vocation, so I've not got
yeah,
holy orders. So
yep.
I'm just gonna. It's almost like the equivalent of going to the seminary and saying it's not for me, and then moving on to something else.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a little bit more unique. Very commonly, if someone was made a cardinal, yeah, well, if someone was made a cardinal, normally you had to pry that out of their cold, dead hands because they were already quite powerful, especially back then in the international influence department. Is the cardinalcy was very heavily coveted. So the idea of one wanting to stop was like outrageous as well for the Cardinals. They're like, why would you even? But they're fine with it because one fewer cardinal means their vote is a little bit more powerful. That's actually something else which is interesting in the dynamic.
Yeah.
It sounds crude, but there's a lot of a lot of that back then. Because again, even though these are clerics and these are popes and cardinals, they are still humans. And I think that's an interesting sort of lead into the I would say political dynamics of Italy at the time, which I think was very important for how this worked. So Italy at the time was spread or split between a number of city-states, regions, the papal states, which a lot of people have heard of, but they couldn't really draw on a map. Maybe you, if you looked at it, you could. But the papal states, for instance, is Rome and a bunch of territory surrounding Rome and spreading out, and I think possibly even reaching the eastern coast. But then you have Venice, you have Genoa. I don't know how to. People who are speaking Italian, they can correct my pronunciation. So Venice, Genoa, Milan, all those sorts of things. And they're basically individual city-states. This is very unique in, well, not very, but it's somewhat unique in Europe at the time, where you had France, which was still somewhat a divided kingdom, but it was France, so to speak. All of these regions were being claimed by France or English or Spain or that sort of thing. But Italy was just no, we're actually a fully divided, non-united region. And what you have is powerful families who are becoming very influential in Italy and in their own city-states. Then these powerful families are having people entering the church and becoming priests, and then bishops, and then cardinals. And then these families are thinking, oh, the more powerful our relative in the church gets in the church, the better off we are in our standing in Italian politics, because no one in Italy wanted to tick off the Pope. That's the thing to keep in mind, is that Rome is basically the center of Italy. It's very important and influential, depending on the time, but just geopolitically, it's important, and it also relies on other people. So if the Pope is from some family who happens to be the ruling family of Milan, suddenly Milan and Rome have the strongest alliance ever, because the ruler of Milan is such and such, and the Pope is his brother. Like that sort of thing. It's human nature. It's just how it works. It's borderline inescapable. But what you have is a unique scenario where a bunch of them got together. You have all these rival families trying to create their factions and blocks inside of the conclave, and eventually they give up on trying to compromise, because there's been so much bad blood for the last couple of popes, that they say, you know what, we can't even agree, we're going to choose this guy. And this was the first Borgia pope. They thought, he's a foreigner, he's a barbarian. So he's a foreigner because he was Spanish. He's old. He was very old at this time. This pope was elected basically as he's going to die soon. he's not going to do anything. It's going to be fine. And then we can get back to fighting in 5 years after he's dead. But right now we can't agree. So he was a compromised pope. That actually happened a couple of times to varying degrees of success. So he gets appointed. What they did not realize is that this Spaniard had very specific ideas on how the church should function and the papacy. And he kicked off a big reform of how the papacy functions. So to summarize a cultural difference, Italians very disunified. They don't believe, so to speak, in strong, united, centralized power. Spanish, a very different culture. And so he, through his career, grew and fostered very strong ideals of a strong papacy and a powerful papacy, and one that is no longer, which is getting out of the humiliations, which arguably the last however many 100 years were quite humiliating for the papacy, actually, and just being knocked around by powerful kings, almost kicked off by, I think, there's the famous story of Philip the Fair. I haven't read this recently, so I'll quote it very, very loosely. Philip the Fair was a strong centralizing king of France. When the Pope ticked him off, he sent one of his nobles, and this man slapped the Pope in the face. Right? This was the slap that was heard around the Catholic world. It was just the idea of striking the Pope. It's just egregious. So that kicks off a whole period of time, which is just very difficult for the papacy in regards to their amount of control and influence, even temporally. So this man comes in. He doesn't have connections to any of the local Italian families. So he doesn't have any influence from any of the Italian families, which means and Spain is very far away. He can't really help Spain. I mean, he probably could if he really wanted to, but it's not close, if that makes sense. So no one in Spain is asking for, hey, can I do this? I mean, some of them are like, actually, a lot of people would come over to Italy and try and get jobs. That's a relevant point. So he takes over the papacy. He doesn't have connections to any of the local Italian families. And so his loyalty, I know this sounds crazy, his loyalty as the Pope is only to the church and to Rome. What? This is insane. And so he is arguably impartial. So he starts doing all of these things which are ticking off all of the Italian families. It's ridiculous. Normally the playbook was you would tick off half of them and get half of them on your side, and then the next pope would do the reverse, and then they maybe divide it into quarters.
Sounds like modern political parties.
Yeah, basically it was just problematic. But again, it was a situation they were dealt with, because if you were too strong a pope and you alienated your own family because they said, hey, can we maybe get some of this, a little bit of help, and you said, oh no, that would be unbecoming of the papacy, then all of a sudden even your family wants you gone. No one likes you. So, but the problem is that when the Spanish entered Italy, they started from a place of no one liking them, so they didn't care. So he starts kicking off reforms. They were right. The cardinals were right. He did not last very long. But one of the things he did was he appointed his nephew, well documented, his nephew, Rodrigo Borgia, who becomes Pope Alexander VI a number of decades later. So he gets appointed. As he starts dying, he's not even dead yet. But when the news gets out that he's dying, the Italians, or the Romans specifically, go on just a spree of beating up the Spanish people who live in Rome. So this was a phenomenon that also happens is,
hey, as in physically beating them up.
Yeah. So what would happen is, whenever a pope gets elected, there would be a wave of migrants from his hometown or from his family to Rome, because like, hey, my family member is the pope. do you want to buy my vegetables? Like, like they would come there, they'd set up businesses. They had connections, man. They didn't. A lot of them technically didn't have connections, but in name it was, yeah, my relative is the Pope. He's so great. He's my like everyone knows the Pope, right? Once when he's got the same last name as you. So that would happen where there'd be a wave of people. Then when the Pope begins to die, normally they wait until he's dead. They didn't even wait this time because he ticked them off so much. So this Pope had two nephews at the time. One of them was a military leader, and the other
So
one
are we
was
talking about Pope Alexander the Sixth or the one before?
back to the Pope Sixtus.
Pope Sixtus.
We're still talking about Pope Sixtus the something. It will be in the book. Actually, just give me a second. It'll be the name of the title probably. So basically what will happen is, it's actually not the name of the chapter. So what would happen is the Pope would die or begin to die, and the wave of immigrants from his hometown or home city or home region would then be kicked out by the Romans, because the Romans at that point seemed to be just quite unpleasant people. They didn't like immigrants. They didn't like foreigners, and foreigner at that point meant a guy from the city, the next city over, right? So that was what they didn't like. And if it was from Spain, that was even worse, because they're not even on the same world as you anymore. You've got to, you might even have to go over onto a boat to go there. That's just crazy. So he starts dying. One of his nephews is driven out of Rome because they're trying to kill him, right? This isn't the cardinal. The cardinal actually stayed behind, because he said, I'm still a cardinal. I actually have a role. This is Rodrigo Borgia, the future Pope Alexander. But yeah, the Spanish houses and shops are just being broken into and raided and looted, and the Spanish people are being beaten up, and then they're
Italian
just fleeing the
Catholics doing
city.
this.
Yeah, exactly. That's all you need to know. No. So they just drive them out of the city as quickly as they can. And this happens every single time, by the way. When there was a Pope from Milan, when he dies, all of the Milanese people are beaten up and thrown out of Rome. When it's a Pope from Florence, all of the Florentines are beaten up and kicked out of Rome. It's like, get out of here. Things are going to change. Your Pope's not around to protect you anymore. He wasn't really doing much.
This explains how the mafia came about. They were great for centuries.
There's something in there. There's something in the blood. Ironically, the Sicilians actually were rarely involved. Sicily was like a world away because it was an island. This is just ironically enough. So that's what you have. I think that's an important scene to set, though, in that they hated non-Romans, but the Italians hated non-Italians. When Pope Sixtus was elected, they said, we have a barbarian Pope because he's from Spain. Europe wasn't really the concept that it is now. The European identity is somewhat relatively modern, actually. But so that's the situation you have, is that they just don't like it. They don't like the foreigners. And specifically, they don't like a Pope who is ticking off everyone in Italy. You're only supposed to tick off between a third and a half at a time. That's the rule. So you have this scenario, which is, again, very important for historical context, which is he's annoying a lot of people. And that makes people not want to write very nice things about him. However, this Pope Sixtus was, as far as I'm aware, he was impeccable. No one wrote anything bad about him, except he appointed one of his nephews to be a cardinal, which was just fully accepted practice at the time. No one cared.
And also,
if
you look at the context, he's probably got not many people in his network he can actually trust to do good work.
That's a very important point, which is also made, is that, yes, cardinals very often would appoint a family member so that there was one person they could trust who wasn't trying to stab them in the back. Again, an important context. Some of them did go insane and just like appoint everybody in their family to something. But it was very difficult to find someone you could trust. Just because you won the election doesn't even mean the ones who voted for you actually like you very much. Oftentimes they might vote for fully political reasons. It will be, I'm not going to get the papacy, but I don't want him to get the papacy. That's even worse. So I'm going to vote for this guy, and because he's in the middle. So that's the scene you set. Pope Alexander VI was even more outrageous to the Italians, and lived longer and ticked off so many more people. He did manage to tick off every single kingdom and city state in Italy. That was his unique. That was his superpower.
And what did he do that ticked him off?
So the first set is he basically said, "Hey, the papacy is the supreme ruler of the Catholic Church." I know it's crazy. No, that wasn't the word for word. But so in the political spectrum, so you remember I mentioned the papal states, which is Rome and a bunch of territory. This was given to the Pope by Charlemagne. I think Charlemagne's father, King Pepin, or something like that. But one of the Frank Holy Roman Emperors, well, sorry, he wouldn't have been a Holy Roman Emperor. But when the Franks swept down, they beat up the Lombards and got rid of and freed Italy from the barbarian invasion. I haven't read that story myself too deeply, but it was granted to Rome and the papacy by someone who at a certain point had control of most of Italy, I'm guessing at least. And so he said, you can have that. That's part of the papal state. So you should have a buffer state that you're allowed to control, because at this point, the Pope was also a temporal ruler. This is another thing people don't think about, because now the Pope the Pope's just the Vatican, if that makes sense. It's not even Rome anymore. It's just the Vatican, or the Vatican City. But at that time, the Pope was the political head of Rome, the political leader, and he was the political leader of the papal states. He was not the political leader of anywhere else. He couldn't just claim land, but you have arguably a dual role of, he is a spiritual leader, obviously. He's the head of the Catholic Church, but he is a political ruler as well. And those are arguably different functions. So it was considered, and actually not done very often. So I'll summarize. So a pope could go to war for political reasons against a neighboring city. Like, he could lead an army. He probably wouldn't kill people, but he could be a military leader who would lead armies to fight other cities. But he wouldn't excommunicate them. And he wouldn't use spiritual power to pressure them, because that was a different set of rules. So there could be political clashes which were different to spiritual clashes. There could be spiritual clashes which were completely different to political clashes. So the Pope could excommunicate someone, but that doesn't mean he's going to go march there and fight the people. There are two different worlds you have here, which you have the Pope who's the ruler of both, functioning both, but they're still separate to a point. And again, nowadays people don't think of that, so almost all of it sounds a little bit strange. Again, though, the church always, even up until Vatican II, the church would engage politically, because again, the world is, runs on politics. So in order to take care of Catholics throughout the world, they would have to engage. But back then it was different, because he actually was a ruler with not insignificant amounts of territory. But what had happened was, when the Pope had been banished or taken to France, the papal states had just been occupied and stolen by these different Italian families. And what would happen is, so there would be an Italian group who owned this town, this city, blah, blah, blah. And these are all papal territories. And the Pope would say, hey, that's actually mine. That belongs to the papacy. Can you please leave? And they would say, no, thank you. Now, one important distinction is, in the papal states, because that was so closely related to the papacy. It was basically considered theft of property to occupy that territory. And popes could exercise excommunication and penalties like that against people for political, what's the word? For what would be classed as immoral political actions. Because again, the church and the pope do reserve the right to excommunicate people for immoralities. Especially if they are badly affecting other people. And again, a little different back then. But so the Pope would say, "Can you please leave?" And they'd say no. And so the Pope would say, "Darn it." So he would find another family of mercenaries and say, "Hey, can you please kick them out?" And they say, "Perfect. That sounds so great." And he says, "I'll pay you such and such." And they're like, "Perfect." So they go in there, they fight them, they beat them up, and they drive these people out. And then the Pope would say, "Oh, thank you so much for driving them out of my territory. Well, yeah, have a good trip back to Milan." And they would say, "Oh, no, we're here now. We fought for this and we've got it." And he was like, "Yeah, but I paid you." And they were like, "Yeah, thanks. That actually helps us a lot because we fixed the walls really quick." So that was happening where popes were getting some families to fight their rivals, and just the whole territory was just in a tug of war back and forth. Now, ironically, everyone was happy with this. It was considered a functioning political landscape and a very balanced situation. But the problem came when Pope Alexander VI just sent out a declaration, and he said, everybody who is on papal territory lands without permission is a squatter and a thief, and they have to leave. And he had a very powerful weapon at this point, and this was that France, the new king of France, and the Pope had just patched things up from a lot of previous bad blood. France had also invaded Italy at this point and then just left like a little bit before. So they knew each other. They'd been introduced, and the Pope was able to say, "I have very powerful allies now. The French are fine with me. Even the Spanish are kind of okay with him." Ironically, the Spanish didn't see him as, "Oh, he's the Spanish Pope. That's great." Other people saw that. The Spanish didn't. They actually, King Ferdinand was, as this book, it's almost like every time it mentions King Ferdinand, it says he was furious at the Pope or something. But so he says, all of those people in the papal states leave. You have to, or you're excommunicated because you're stealing territory. Nobody liked this in Italy. It was the biggest power play of a pope in temporal power, possibly ever, actually. And so this made everybody extremely uncomfortable, all of the Italians. So they could not wait to get rid of him anymore. He had upset the political balance of Italy because he wasn't Italian. He wasn't his loyalty was to Rome and to the papacy. And Italians didn't like that because they wanted Rome and the papacy to actually be just not even a main player, but a second class player in Italian politics. So that happens there. All of a sudden, there are stories from all of these different, all these different city-states and kingdoms in Italy, of people talking about how bad Pope Alexander VI is. The thing to note is that none of these people actually ever met him or knew him or went to Rome. I say none. I couldn't name all of them off the top of my head. He mentions a couple, but again, nothing they said was ever as bad as the future stories. So this, I think, leads into another situation, which is there's a snowball effect of what happens. And there was a lot that happened after him. So there seemed to be a concerted effort among the Italian clergy and cardinalcy at the time, where they decided we will never have a Spanish Pope again. It's too dangerous. And you will notice that there is a long-standing lineage of popes who are Italian, and then Italian, and then they're Italian. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. The Pope is the Pope. They get elected validly. That's just how it works. So, and again, they're above politics, especially now the way the restrictions have gone. They are above it, so it's not quite the same. But back then, it was definitely a political play because, again, the rule was it doesn't matter who he is. Actually, it doesn't matter what he's done. The Pope, as long as he's not a heretic, obviously, as long as he is a Catholic, the Pope is the Pope. And they knew that, and they were smart about that, and so they knew that however they got control of the papacy, it didn't matter. But so they basically, somewhere along the line, it was decided we will never have a Spanish Pope again. It's too dangerous. It's not good. They're too papal. I'd say would probably have been their complaint. They're too loyal to Rome, and they're not loyal to the Italian states. So you have a scenario where within maybe 200 years, I think it's within 200 years, probably even quicker, but again, not particularly soon, there are these stories about, but Pope Alexander VI was so this and blah, blah, blah. And again, in the political landscape, that could be intended as a dig by different papal claiming factions, not claim it, that's not the right word, but different, because there were factions and there are groups, voting groups in the cardinalcy and in the church who would say, we want this guy to be the Pope, blah, 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 blah. And so they could very harshly bring up these stories in the lead up to a papal conclave as, for lack of a better term, campaigning. And oftentimes it's much easier, even in modern politics, it's much easier to campaign against someone than to campaign for yourself. So it's much easier to say they're all so bad and blah, 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 blah. And me, I haven't even done anything wrong yet. That sort of thing. So that's what was going on. So you have a few things that line up. First of all, the Italians didn't like the Spanish Pope. They didn't like anybody, but that was fine. Then a very important thing happens not very long after this, and this is the Protestant revolt. Now, there are three things that Protestants hate, especially the English and the Dutch, actually. I'll introduce a concept called the Black Legend. I don't know if you've heard of that. Does that ring any bells for you? So the Black Legend is, I read this very recently somewhere, but it was a complete global narrative myth proliferated by Protestants and prolific in the English language against, and this is actually this is the telling thing, it was against Spain, Spanish Catholics, and the Catholic Church and the papacy, in that order. So that's the order of things that Protestants, especially English and Dutch Protestants, but all Protestants at the time, that's the list of things that they hate in order: Spain, Spanish Catholics, the Catholic Church, and the papacy.
And why did they hate? So just to give context, why was Spain so hated by the English? Was it purely political, just political powers? Like, what was the reasoning?
So have you heard of the Counter Reformation?
Rings a bell, but I can't recall. Maybe
tell
the audience.
Yeah, no worries. So there was the Reformation, which was the Protestants, right? The Protestant Reformation, Luther. Then there was the Counter Reformation, which some people, I think there's the idea that it was, we're countering the Reformation, because we're opposing the Reformation, which is partly true. But what was probably more important is that it was the church saying, this is our Reformation to counter yours. It's not an anti-Reformation, it's our Reformation, because all of the Catholic world at the time, before the Protestants, did recognize that the church needed to be reformed in some ways. There were lots of things that were just There were abuses and things going wrong. It just, there was lots of stuff that wasn't good. The church was still functioning, arguably, not arguably, but the church was still functioning. People were still receiving the sacraments, saving their souls, hopefully. That's all that stuff. But functionally and politically, there are a lot of reforms needed to be done. And that was encapsulated in the Council of Trent. That was the Counter-Reformation Council. Now, you have a big, what you said, political scenario, which is that when Protestantism exploded onto the scene, there was one Catholic power, which was, and this is actually not arguable, well, maybe it is arguable if people have it, but the most powerful European nation at the time was Spain. That was just hands down. They had finished the Reconquista. They had exploded onto European politics and global domination as well, entering into the Americas. This was before any other country could possibly hope to achieve anything. The closest that had access to that sort of technology and capability was Portugal, but Portugal was just too small. Their population was tiny. They didn't have that sort of reach. So the Protestant Reformation happens in 3 places, very important places. There's Germany, everyone knows that. There's England, everyone knows that. And there's the Low Countries, or the Netherlands, Holland, the Dutch. Now, so at this point, so this is on from the time of the Borgia popes. So this is 100 or so years later. I don't know the numbers immediately. So the Spanish Empire is joined with the Habsburg Empire. So the Habsburg ruler, Charles V, is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He's the king of Austria and the king of all Spain's, it's called. So he was the king of Spain and that monarch. He was one of the most prolific anti-Protestant leaders and warriors ever. He was the one who led the first war of religions against the Protestant League. So the Protestants explode onto the scene. They're a very different breed of people to now, by the way. Protestants now are kind of all nice, and it depends on which denomination you've got, but they're just sort of all nice, and they've got their Bible, and they're quoting scripture at you. Back then, they were quoting scripture at you while they stabbed you. Like, that was the idea, is that they were more the equivalent of militant terrorists. Actually, that was a thing. They were anti establishment, again, because the establishment was Catholic. They were actual political revolutionaries very often. They were not just clerics who were trying to preach and be all peaceful. And this happened everywhere. You see this in every single Protestant situation. Now, what happens is Spain completely bans Protestantism. Being Protestant is punishable by death, right? So they brought that in. I think, so other countries were very sort of wishy-washy about it. We'll kill them every now and then, blah, blah, blah. But the Spanish and again, the Habsburgs just said, that's it. No. Protestantism never took root in Spain. Never took root in South America until after, I think, the 1900s, when those countries became independent and they lifted a lot of the restrictions that Spain had. So Protestants don't like Spain because Spain said, we are anti-Protestant. That's it. We want to destroy Protestantism. That was the active goal, was to end Protestantism. And so this starts in Germany. So during this time, the Spanish rulers control, again, Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, which is loosely, it's contested, arguably, and they also own the Netherlands, right? So you have a situation where the Netherlands enters a revolution, basically, against the Spanish. And some people say it's because of Protestantism. if you look back at it, it seems more that they used Protestantism as their tool. So a prime example, not to get too off topic, but I think that's just going to happen. So in the Netherlands, there was a event which was called Iconoclast Fury, which is where one day all of the Dutch Protestants, I think they were Lutheran, just went on a rampage throughout all of these cities in the Netherlands, and they broke into churches. They destroyed pictures and windows. They didn't hurt that many people, so that was nice. But there are stories of them ripping off the head coverings of nuns and things like that, because Protestants didn't believe in nuns or monks. They didn't even believe in priests, arguably, but they didn't believe in any vocation for women except marriage. And so it was an affront to their biblical scholarship that women could actually, live in cloisters and things like that. So they framed it as the Holy Spirit has moved us to destroy all of these idolatrous statues and pictures and all this. And everyone at the same time. We didn't even plan it. We definitely didn't plan it. It's just everyone in Holland was just moved on the same night to just go on this absolute storm throughout the entire country or region. Bearing in mind, they took with them lists of things they were meant to steal from the churches to later sell to fund their future rebellion against Spain. And it was very successful. It was a very successful business move. So they just raided all these churches for all the gold and wealth and whatever, like these are like holy, what are they called? Holy vessels and things like that, because they didn't care. But the probably tabernacles as well. It was probably a horrific situation. Spain had control and ownership of, or the Habsburgs rather, had ownership of the Netherlands. So this completely horrific and blasphemous event has happened in a territory controlled by the Catholics. And so it happened under their watch. They're thinking, what have we let happen here? And they come down like a hammer because, again, it's happened under their watch. And so they come down, they go into the Netherlands, and they're like, this is it. We need to get this sorted. So there a whole host of things happen. I'll just summarize it. The Spanish eventually are forced out of the Netherlands. So they sign it away and they say, you know what, you just do you do your thing. I think that might have happened at the Treaty of Westphalia. You don't need to know what that is. It's just the treaty that happened. But it's interesting to know.
Wait, so just to clarify, so the Spanish and Habsburgs go, we're going to deal with these Protestants that just did this horrific thing, but then they did they lose essentially? Like they ended up giving the Netherlands to someone else?
Well, what follows that leads into a whole other live stream, I think. But what follows is, so they go into there, and every single Protestant nation somehow manages to be fighting Spain at the exact same time. So that Spain was the only Catholic nation, I think, which was actively engaged in wars against all of the Protestant nations, even if at different times. Again, this is a 50-year period. It's on and it's off and it's on and it's off again. It's politics. But so they've done arguably the Spanish thing, which is managed to tick off everybody through their Catholic endeavors, really is what it was. So a lot of the Protestant Reformation happened in territory which was under the ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire in the Habsburg joint at that point under Charles V. So it's directly in his backyard. It's under his authority. And so he has to deal with it. That's the thing. He actually, ironically enough, in earlier days was on good terms with Henry VIII. They worked closely together. But the English went a different way, which then put them on the radar for the Catholic to deal with, although they did do it first. They were the ones who were aggressors. So every single Catholic movement, every single Protestant movement came into direct conflict with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. But more specifically, when the Holy Roman Empire and Spanish Empire split, that happened because Charles V had two sons. He put one in charge of Spain and the other in charge of the Holy Roman Empire, because he said it's too much for one man to deal with. I did it my whole life. It's terrible. I wouldn't do that to my children. Like, that's actually what happened. So that splits. So they both become unique. Spain is put by itself on a collision course with all of the maritime empires, especially the Protestant ones, who are England and the Netherlands. Now, England, I don't know if many people know this, but England actually has a little bit of a monopoly on a language called English, which is a language a lot of people speak, especially in countries which are called Anglophone countries, which, again, I don't know if people know this, but in Australia, we actually speak English, and in America, we speak English, and in a lot of Canada, they speak English. They speak French, but that's another problem. But so what has happened is the English language became the propaganda language of Protestantism. And this is very important. So the Italians would make up stuff about the Borgias and about the Spanish. Oh, they're so bad. We don't like them. Keep them out of Italy. Blah, blah, blah. They did it arguably in good fun. It was just some harmless lies and propaganda. But when this reaches the Protestants, it takes on a whole other level. So the Protestants then turn it into, oh, no, this is like, we're in a holy clash with these horrible people. Like the Spanish, it's just immorality is flowing from their veins. Like it becomes like that level. And so they just take on this huge propaganda war. A lot of England and the British Empire actually is as a result of them having to maneuver around how powerful Spain was and how dangerous Spain was, and how existential a threat to them Spain was, because Spain always had on the list every Protestant country. That's basically how it worked when they were powerful. And another thing to point out is the Protestants were on a new level of ideological. So you hear a lot about ideology and that sort of thing, especially now. The age of, or the century of ideologies was like the 1800s leading into the 1900s. World War II is sometimes classed as the ideological war, because you had, National Socialism, you had communism, you had basically it was
Democracy.
the biggest. Yeah, it was the biggest clash, where it wasn't just politics. It was, we're on a collision course because we have vastly different ideological views, and those are in clash. Whereas a lot of the time, there's always different reasons. Religion was actually one of the rarer reasons, ironically enough. Even the religious wars would not have happened had the Protestants not put themselves on a political collision course with the Catholics. There's so much evidence of attempts at negotiation, attempts at conversion, and blah, 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 blah. It was not until the Protestants formed a league of defense and caused enough problems that the Catholics said, I think we need to actually deal with this militarily, because it's getting dangerous, it's getting deadly, people are getting, murdered and killed, and there are rebellions as bad. We just need to deal with this. They're actually an existential threat. So the church dealt with them much more nicely in the beginning. It was attempts at conversion, bringing them back, attempts at even trying to get Luther to come to Rome, speak your case, And we'll see what happens. I don't think he much liked that idea. I think he was a little bit worried, depending on what he was going to say. But so that's the scenario you get, is that the biggest rival that England had was Spain. A lot of people say that it was France, but it's a very different sort of rivalry. England and France were kind of, they come from a similar, arguably political background, but the rivalry between England and Spain was much more existentially threatening to England. And so they were constantly framing that everything they did, they would what's the word? They would overwhelmingly target Catholic countries and Catholic nations to hamper and destroy and fight against and that sort of thing, because Catholicism was the existential threat to Protestantism, which was, for them, it was England. And so that's what led to the black legend of, basically, the English Protestants had decided the only way for us to really justify ourselves and what we're doing is to frame it as a holy war, where we're fighting against the evil empire, the worst people in the world, the papal tyrant. That's, the Catholics are this. Meanwhile, Protestantism had the hallmarks of an ideological force, arguably one of the first in early modern history, it's called, which is that they would say, oh my gosh, the Catholics, they did this, they killed townspeople. Oh, that's so terrible. So you know what we have to do? We need to kill all their townspeople. But it's fine because we're good. So that was the big difference, is that you see this a lot, especially in the religious wars, is that the Catholics had very strict moral rules on what you were supposed to do. That, obviously, we all know about that, but even stricter in political sense and in warfare. And so there were a bunch of things you weren't allowed to do. You weren't allowed to, murder innocent people or loot or that sort of thing. But there are these things called human beings, and they have things called weaknesses and human nature. And so people would themselves, in their own capacity, break those rules and commit abuses and commit atrocities. And that was bad for them to do. They shouldn't have done it. And if they get caught, they should be punished. But it wasn't systematic. And I think that's the big distinction, is that throughout Europe and the Catholic Church and what, there are abuses and there are atrocities, but they're not systematic. They're not coming from the top. They're not intended. That's why they're called abuses. Otherwise, they would just be Tuesday, But in Protestant countries, they weren't abuses. So in the religious wars, you have the Protestant leaders saying, oh, the Catholics, they're doing all this terrible stuff. They're so bad, but we're good. And because we're good, we can do bad stuff, and when we still get to be good. So that's great. So they would actively encourage their people to loot cities and sack towns and steal food from peasants and all that, because again, they were arguably the terrorist militants, so they didn't have the same sort of infrastructure yet. And so they would engage in all the things that they accused the Catholics of. But the thing is, the Catholics were bad, and so what they did was bad. But their idea was, because we're good, we are justified. That was the word of the time. And so that leads to a whole scenario of the English deciding the more bad stuff we can attribute to Spain and Spanish Catholics and the papacy, the more bad stuff we can attribute to them, the more bad stuff we can get away with and still be good. So they would find atrocities and abuses, and their treasure trove, especially in the Spanish Empire, their treasure trove of bad stuff that the Spanish did was actually Spanish internal audits and reports. So when there were abuses and atrocities, the Spanish would send them to the king. You could have a guy get beaten up in the street in some random town in South America, and that could be written in a letter, and the King of Spain could open it, and say, seriously, what are they beating up my Indians for? And so, like, that was actually a thing, is that they had a big, deep bureaucratic process of recourse, it was called. And so there are loads of reports of bad things happening to native people. The point of those reports is they were saying, this is bad, we shouldn't do it, can someone fix it? That's the point. And so the English would say, oh my gosh, they're doing all this bad stuff, that's so terrible. And then people will be like, oh, but what are you doing, England? And they're like, oh, we're so good, that's fine. There's no reports, so that must mean that there's an interesting comparison I heard, which was people say that there are thousands of reports or complaints from South American natives in the Spanish bureaucracy. And people say, well, that's evidence of how bad it was. But how many written complaints sent to Washington are there from the slaves in America in the 1800s? I would argue not that many. Because at that point,
which means that they probably had complaints. They just, they didn't
at that
actually
point,
acknowledge them.
Well, at that point, it was illegal for blacks to be taught how to read or write.
Oh dear.
So that could be a whole other thing. It's like the lack of reports does not mean that there wasn't stuff going on. It just means that they were looking at it. But so the English had a treasure trove, and their practice was, we will record what we do in a much better light and what they have done in a much worse light. Again, they had to extensively quote Catholics, some of them propagandizing, like the Italians, some of them just reporting, this bad stuff happened, it shouldn't be happening, and we're in charge. It's our job to make sure it doesn't happen. It's called responsibility. And so that is what would be the, again, the treasure trove that the English could call on for their propaganda. As long as the Spanish were a little bit worse than them, it was fine. But anyway, so that's a little bit of a tangent. But,
so it was a good tangent. Basically, bring it back to the Borgias. You've essentially given the context as to why the Protestants, they had this black legend in which they said that we hate Spain, Spanish Catholics,
Catholic Church and the Papacy.
Church, Catholic Church and the Papacy. Kind of, and you've got, just to kind of sum it up for the audience so far as well. So you start off with these Italian Catholics in Rome that start not liking what Spain, the Spanish Pope, is doing.
Yep.
So they start kind of doing things like propaganda or lies, and kind of just like, he's annoying, we don't like him, he's doing this terrible thing, look at this and this.
Yeah. Again, some of these are egregious lies, like actually horrific.
Yeah, egregious lies. And this rumor in a different language comes to England, and Protestants who already hate Spain and already hate Catholicism and want to defeat them,
and the papacy.
Go up, and the papacy. So they think this is amazing. We can take these lies in a different language. We can translate into our own language, which means we can also add whatever we want and spread it around.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's an important context, is that there's something people need to keep in mind, is that, so I mentioned,
Channel, just quickly, I like to give comments from the audience here. So we got from Crusader Filmworks, thank you for your comment. The English have also harbored hostility towards Spain ever since Henry VIII led the entire country into apostasy. Don't know if you have anything to add there.
Before that, they actually had reasonably good relations with Spain. That's the ironic thing, is that it was always the apostasy which was the turning point. You can contrast this with other countries such as France, who was so hyper political in the religious wars. The French allied with the Protestants against the Catholics, while France was Catholic and being led by a cardinal. This is like mind-boggling, but it's the politics of the time. But I think if you don't have any more comments that have come up yet, I'll just introduce.
Continue.
Yeah. So I mentioned this to you the other day, but there's history, which is what's recorded, and then there's historiography, which is like the study and the discipline of how history is written. And I think that there's a lot of that. Well, lots of people might not have even heard that word, but there's a lot of important stuff there. Is that there is a lot of history which is just wrong. It just was written by people who don't care, or who did care about something. And because there's a difference between a contemporary source writing, this is what I saw, this is what happened. That's very different to, hey, this happened 500 years ago. I watched a movie once, like that. You need to be pretty critical. And that's the thing in this book. Let me see if he's got a bibliography here. Bibliographies are extremely important, because if you know enough about it, yeah. So the bibliography here is 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 5 pages. Oh, 5 pages long. So that's the
If you get a
sources that he
history
went
book
to.
with a very small and non-existent bibliography, you then go, "Did you just make this up?"
Well, that can happen. Again, though, I mean, if you're a guy just writing a paragraph to your boys, you don't need to have a bibliography. But this is scholarship, right? That's what it is. So it needs to hold up to scholarly. It needs to have scholarly support. But so I think the important introduction for people who maybe are already interested in history, or maybe they're not that interested and they just thought they'd come watch this, and then they managed to get through an hour and a half of this, which, like, I mean, canonize them now. So I think what's important and interesting about this book and this sort of thing is that it breaks down the concept of established narratives, because in history there's not really such thing. There shouldn't be such thing. Some things are too far away. There's not enough written. You actually just don't know. Arguably, the only absolute known about history is that something happened and it led to this. What happened exactly, how it happened, and why it happened is so complex that it's hard to summarize in any book. But you still need to care enough about finding the truth, because that can have big ramifications. Like, you say, oh, someone did this and they were so great, but if you find out, well, actually they were a horrible person and they had all these horrible ideas, why did they do that? Like, again, even bad people can do good things and good people can do bad things, but sometimes bad people do good things for bad reasons, and that makes it bad. Like, and sometimes good people do bad things for good reasons. Again, that doesn't make it good, but it can be a mistake, a misjudgment. People do make mistakes. Good people who do bad things can be a mistake. Like, and that's another thing to keep in mind. Again, good people can just do bad things and they shouldn't have done it and they should have known better. Yeah, so one thing I'll mention that he mentions, G.J. Meyer, is he mentions a writer in the early 1900s named Peter DeRue, which I think is very relevant for Australians. So
Is that a
Peter
kangaroo
DeRue,
joke?
yes. I'm just going to double check
Oh
this, because
no.
I think he was a priest. So Father
While,
Peter.
while you're double checking, I just got another comment here. Thank you, Crusader Filmworks. By the way, leading up to the American Civil War, the North was already spreading extensive anti-Southern propaganda. Check out the book, The War Between the States. A little bit of a different topic, but Chan, have you read that book?
Take a photo of that. No, I haven't read that. But no, that wouldn't surprise me, because I don't. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the American government and establishment was in their attempts to have a complete cultural rupture with English background, they maintained the English strain of Protestantism, which led to a tendency towards propaganda in the same way. They were generally less, how do you say, threatened, I think, by other countries. So their their propaganda might not be as prolific as much as just copying what the English said about stuff. But again, no one's free from propaganda. Everyone likes to say something the way it's nice for them. That's just how it goes. And everyone likes to say bad things about people they don't like. No one's free from
Including
that.
Catholics, as we see from the
Exactly.
Italians when.
But
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, and Crusader Filmworks says, thanks for sharing out my comments. Always enjoy watching these TR lives. Thank you for the comment, and very
Absolutely.
glad to hear it. Alexander, back to you.
Yeah, so I'll say that not to be too cynical and pessimistic, but the English language in general, I'll pull something up. The English language in general is quite poor in actual proper history of other countries, even their own, actually, to a point, because you have a situation where the English have a rupture with their Catholic past, and that was there was again a Protestant who wrote about it, who said that the English view of English history before Henry VIII was that it was popish nonsense or something like that. Again, this is what led them to who they were. Well, the good things, hopefully, and then the bad things were them. They did that. That was their decision. But you have a situation where they have a rupture against their Catholic past. So they can even have propaganda about how bad it was before then. The French have the same thing with the revolution. They have propaganda about France before the revolution. Oh, it was so terrible. And I would argue that most of the world is either brand new or built on a hard rupture against the past, which probably leads into people's view of history as, oh, well, it's just, history started, 150 years ago. And before that, or more specifically, morality started, 150 years ago. That's when morality started. Before that, no one cared and everyone was Catholic. So it was terrible. That was sort of the idea. And so every country is either new or built on a complete rupture from their past. There are very few institutions which have existed for more than 200 years, actually. Political institutions, definitely. I think I saw that, like, the Icelandic parliament claims to have the longest running parliament, 1,000 years. Whoa, okay, that's pretty insane. So props to them. I think the University of Bologna in Italy, again, correct my language, is like the oldest how do you say, education institution to have lasted centuries, hundreds of years, just sort of beating out Oxford, I think. But so that's the thing, is that most, like, those, you pick them out. It's like, where is it? There's not that much. There is no continuous institution the way that there used to be, except the Catholic Church, obviously, is the longest running institution, but very different. It's not political. It's above all that. But you have a situation where a lot of these countries, by the time they hit their power in Europe, they had been shaping and growing and evolving for hundreds of years, like 500, 600, 700 years. And then they hit their peak or whatever, and then Europe explodes onto the world. It stops being the backwater underdog, which it actually was. Europe was the underdog of the world at that point in the Dark Ages, as defined by...
Who were the big dogs?
The Ottomans, or not the Ottomans at that point, the Muslims, very, very powerful. And more so, it was that the Christendom was boxed in by Muslims to the south and east. To the east, you had Orthodox weren't normally that powerful, but big buffer. Then you have, like, the Mongols and the big eastern hordes coming in. You have the Chinese Empire, which is gigantic and extremely powerful, and also extremely long lasting, going back even further. Their dynasties changed, so there is rupture there. And then you have the Scandinavian pagans who are putting pressure onto the north of Europe with their seafaring and Viking ways. And so all of this stuff sort of changed a little bit when the Scandinavians started to convert. And then the Mongols, like this book even talks about it, the Mongols swept through Russia. They entered the Balkans. They were in Hungary. They were, if they had just, clicked their fingers, they could have started walking and they would have just swept through all of Europe. No one in Europe could have stood against them. But then, inexplicably, people still don't know how or why, they just turned around and went back. Right? So that's just an interesting historical fact. The Mongols reached Europe. They could have entered all the way through France quite easily, and they just turned around and left. No one knows exactly what happened. Their sources don't fully talk about it. But these sorts of things happen. Is that all of these existential threats that are surrounding Europe, one day it ends. The Spanish kick the Muslims out of Spain in the fall of Granada, which arguably the fall of Granada was actually the day that Europe as a power began, as a cultural civilization with global projection. That was the day that Europe began, because Spain was the quietest yet among the most powerful countries in Europe, but their entire focus was on the Muslims in Spain. Their entire focus was on the Reconquista. As soon as that ended, within decades, Spain is a global power. They've gone from being on the peninsula to Europe is projected everywhere. They're pushing into Africa. They're in the Americas. They own the southern part of Italy. They own the Netherlands. They exploded onto the scene, which kicked every single European country into high gear to then begin their own competitions. It was when it was proven to Europe that, hey, we are powerful. And interestingly, I think this is important on what I said before.
I'll be back in a sec, but I can still hear you, so keep going.
Yeah, no worries. One thing important, just to tie back into the point that I made about the long-running organic institutions and nations of before, the way, like what those countries were built on. When Granada fell, when Granada was conquered by the Spanish, King Ferdinand of Spain is quoted as saying, after 714, I think, after 714 years, we have reclaimed our homeland. A loose quote, but just the idea that for 700 years, they had this same goal. Their culture was built on this long legacy of them. Every generation, bar only a few anomalies, was a existential war against the Moors and the Muslims in Spain. And it was, I don't care how long you've been here, this is still our land. You kicked us out and we're taking it back. And it was bit by bit by bit after 700 years. And it took 700 years of this growth and this consolidation and this development of institutions. Again, people have no understanding, I think, of the institutions of old monarchies. It was not a centralized system. It was borderline impossible to do that, actually. But it took 700 years for them to become powerful enough to become a global projector. But everyone now wants it now, like, if that makes sense. Everyone wants everything within a generation. And so, but, we haven't even been anywhere near half that long with any modern country. But it took them 700 years of complete struggle and being completely, downtrodden, before they eventually said, oh, we are a country. Really? We have Spain. We have our country. That's it. Now we can just be a country. and that was 700 years. And so every country now is so young and and um and I would say undeveloped. Again, there's a difference between developed, like, oh my gosh, we're a developed country. I don't mean in that sense. I mean the process of development, which takes hundreds of years, hasn't happened yet for most modern countries. I think arguably America might actually be one of the oldest countries now, with like of a functioning, long-standing institution. England will be older. I don't think they've had any revolutions since I last looked. But so you have very few countries which have what's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? A continuous legacy, an unbroken lineage of that institution. Very few. And that leads back to the historical sense of people always care more about their own history. And the history before them, like, it's almost like ancient history. It's like interesting, kind of, if you're interested in it. But that's an artificial rupture, because what happened in Christendom in the early modern era is so important to what happened today that before the rupture is arguably more important than after. What happened before the institutional rupture of Christendom leading to secularization is more important than all the stuff that happened afterwards, because that creates the context for what happened afterwards. And it's been a very bad time, actually. In some ways better, in some ways worse. Like, let's just be real. We do have, I can take painkillers if I've got a headache, like, that sort of thing. But as far as
we don't have Protestants going around, and well, not in our countries anyway. But probably not the Protestants are the violent, but you do have groups, violent groups, but not so much in the societies that we like the Western society.
I mean, it's always it's thing
rare.
Is that
happens.
That sort
rarer.
of that sort of thing is always, it's only a month of it's only a month of escalation away. Not to freak everybody out.
Yeah, but, thanks for that. Just Happy New Year, everyone. Your
I'm going to say
suffering and death is only a month of escalation away.
I'll say years. It's a few years of escalation away. Yeah. No, but I think that's probably the most important point, even just for the whole show, because even though it is about the Borgias, I like to. It's fine to have a few meanings if all of them are right and honest, if that makes sense. And I think people should take history quite seriously. It's not like, you don't cry about it, like, if that sort of thing. You're not a horrible person if you don't read a history book every day. I don't read a history book every day. I actually don't read a huge number of history books. I'd like to read more. So it's not like it's not an obsessive thing, but as far as like interest in, not in knowing it, but in knowing what is true. That's, I think, the important thing. Is it's very hard to know what is true historically 100%. It's not written like novels, if that makes sense. You don't know, you can't hear what people are thinking or whatever, but you can look at what happened.
It's like,
and you can
funny.
find how.
Oh, you go.
No, that was
it's
it.
Funny you're talking about history as well, because I'm rereading Lord of the Rings. I'm now up to the appendix and Return of the King, and I'm probably going to move on to the Silmarillion. And I was reading, and I said to my wife, one thing that, like, it might feel dumb. It's fake history. This is a fake world. But you know what is nice? Is unlike history books, when you're reading it, you know that at least the history in this fiction is true. There's no debate. It's based on fake documents. It's someone's story. It's like, I know that at least it's true because it's from the designer of this fake world. And there's something kind of nice about that, which is still hilarious. But
exactly.
But like, that's so true about the history side. So just to tie it up, we're getting it's kind of you can kind of just read it knowing that it's true because it's fake, as if it's by the author. But yeah, to sum it up, so we've been here for almost 2 hours, which is amazing, and I've seen as well that the viewership has kind of stayed pretty consistent, actually. So to all those who have watched and stayed here, thank you very much, and hope it's been useful. What I would say as well, if you liked this and you like the historical stuff, and you like Alexander's sound of his voice as much as he does, please put into the comments that if you want more, because I run these live streams and I typically organize the topics and the guests. And if there's positive feedback and people want more, then I will respond to that. So if you do want more, a way to get more is really to make it vocal, like in the YouTube comments. Also, if you haven't given this video a like, please do that as well. And obviously hit subscribe if you haven't. So let's sum it up. Chana, sum it up. Well, we've gone a lot around about things, but the Borgias, you've given the context. Sum up though, let's go back to the Borgias. If you had to give a 5 to 10 minute summary of the real truth of the Borgias, what would you say?
I'll say one thing. I'll say first of all is this was quite disjointed the way we talked about it. I kind of just sort of, it's not scripted. I planned to walk in here with this book and that was it. Yeah, again, very disjointed, but it can be more organized if if you catch me at a better time, or if I have more, I guess, drive to plan. But I think touching on a lot of topics might touch something which interests people, even if they're not interested in everything. That's the thing, is that history is, there's part of it for everybody. There's something interesting for everybody. But specifically on this topic, I would say the summary is so there's a concept in the Catholic consciousness, which is people can say to Catholics, oh, Catholics are sinners and they're so bad. And Catholics say, yep, that's us. That's the point. We're humans. And a lot of Catholics will hear propaganda and stories. And in our mind, a bad pope doesn't compromise the faith, obviously. A bad person in history doesn't compromise the church. This is something that we're quite lucky in. Well, I mean, obviously it's by design. It's how it works. But so we can get hit by all of these stories and propaganda. It's like, well, it doesn't shake my faith, because that's not what's important. Because the faith is what's important, and what the church teaches, and the infallibility of that. There's a huge difference between, a bad, immoral pope, okay, and Pope such and such in the year 1200 was a heretic. Oh, hang on, whoa, what's that all about? But I think that a lot of the time Catholics roll over, actually, because it's not in us to need to be apologetic. Yeah, it's not
a pain point for us.
But I think if you actually look at it, there you start to see how important and rich and powerful and influential the Catholic Church and Catholics and popes and those institutions actually were in leading to today. And so I'd say the point about this is don't just roll over when you hear a bad accusation about some person who's Catholic, because people do mean it as a head. This is meant to shake your faith. That's because that's how they are.
I mean, and at the end of the day, if there is fake news, so to speak, of, like, I remember hearing, we've had so many bad popes. Look at Pope, is it Alexander the Sixth?
Alexander the Sixth.
And then you just sort of grow up thinking, we had a bad pope. Yeah. Then you find out, hang on a second.
We weren't even that bad.
We're even better than we thought. Yeah, exactly. It looks like it's all fabricated based on this series of events and the political landscape.
I'd say a quick summary for this. I obviously told the story about the Cesare Borgia. I told the story.
Do you want to show the book again for the audience, because we've probably got more people tuning in?
I told the story of the explanation of how they probably weren't his children, that sort of thing. And one other thing I'll mention is that this guy, he said in his research he would find documents. These are meant to be like documents of records about the people who are supposedly the children of this pope. And he found records where it would say, Cesare Borgia, the son of Scrubbed. Records were being edited in the future. They were being scratched out because people were actively trying to create this narrative. And he said that was part of the problem. Is
that's crazy.
He could almost not say anything definitively because of the lack of again, he found heaps of records of what was going on, but there was arguably there were no vindications. There are logic and there's reasoning and there's blah, blah. It's like, well, if he was like this, maybe he wasn't like that. There was someone who proved that, because they traced the timeline and they said, well, there's the mother of these children and there's him, this Pope who's supposedly the father. They were not in the same region at the time she was having children. There's that. Like, what's the deal there? And just stuff they never looked at. And so, yeah, I would say the point is that that not only were the Borgias not the horrific dark note in Catholic history that you're raised to believe. Again, raised to believe due to the propaganda of some Catholics who made it up and passed it down, and then the Protestants who got hold of it. But the more I read of it, and again, I've not fully finished, the more I read of it, the more it seems like they could have been some of the most important, actually, in shaping the way the church, the direction the church went and the power of the papacy. Because you have that period of time was very instrumental, and it's the lead up to the Council of Trent. These are the predecessors of Pope St. Pius V. Again, one of the most important popes. Well, absolutely, I'd say the most important pope for the Protestant era. But this is a very important time in history. This is the beginning of the Spanish. The next generation is Henry VIII. The Luther's already born, like that sort of thing. This is a very important time, and you've also got, you can't. It's not about taking sides. Obviously, we're on the side of truth and the Catholic Church. Sometimes Catholics go to war against Protestants, and it's not good. It's not the right way to go about it. It's not for the right reasons. It's just political. But at the same time, we shouldn't let ourselves be beaten back into, oh, well, no, that's fine. I'm not going to defend anybody. It's like, it's worth looking at. Even if you find out someone's bad and they did bad things, that's the point. That's all part of it. And again, a big thing in history is modern perspectives very much like to take modern moral ideals and look at them back then. And they're like grouping things together and saying, well, these all have the same name, so they're all the same. Like, even just one example is slavery in England, or in English colonies, and then in Catholic colonies, and even in the Roman Empire, which wasn't Catholic at the time. The word slavery had completely different meanings by the way it was structured, because there were very heavy moral constraints that the church had on how Catholics could treat anybody, for instance. So that's one thing, is people say, oh, slavery. Oh, they had slaves. That was terrible. I mean, yes, it's not good. Like, the Catholics became a bit famous in the Roman Empire for their freeing of slaves whenever they could. But so much stuff just gets grouped together. And that's the thing, is that's why I think non-Catholic apologists or critics, their criticisms of Catholics allow them to group. And so it's like, well, Catholics back then were bad, and then you were bad. Now you're gonna kill me. You know, however. And that grouping is, I think, it's not correct, arguably. It's not correct. But Catholics shouldn't just roll over every time they hear some critique. But at the same time, this obviously leads to a whole other topic of, well, if you're talking to non-Catholics about religious stuff, you shouldn't be talking about history anyway. That's not the important part. That's just interesting.
I think it's more in your mind that you can kind of at least think that, oh no,
Yeah.
that's fabricated, or at least there's it's now heavily doubtful.
There's nothing wrong with being skeptical, because, like I said, the only thing we know for absolute certain is that something happened that led to this. The rest is a matter of discussion. And so people can say, oh, hey, this happened, and you can say, oh, okay, I don't know about that. And they might get offended and be like, yeah, but I told you. It's like, I trust that you believe it. I'm not calling you a liar, but I'm calling you gullible. No, not that either. But that's the thing, is that there's a big difference between being skeptical, accusing someone of being a liar, and just accepting stuff without anything. I mean, if you look at history, there's a lot of stuff. It's like, if it's interesting, it's like, yeah, okay, you can talk. You talk to people about it. It's a matter of discussion. If it comes up with people who are interested in it or who aren't interested in it, and then you just talk to them. Obviously, but yeah, there's a healthy amount of skepticism is interesting, even when reading this, by the way. It's like the writer is only as good as what he's reading and writing about. Even someone who's unbiased, they're trying to be honest, all that stuff, they're trying to do the right thing. They're still working off their sources, and they have to make their decisions on what they write. And so you might read a book, which is an interesting example, is a book by someone named William Thomas Walsh, who was one of the earlier and few Catholic English-speaking writers. He wrote books about Isabella of Spain and the Inquisition. He touched on actually the Borgia popes, but he didn't look into them. So he basically just accepted the narrative. It wasn't a huge part of his story, but it wasn't what he was talking about. So he would mention things about Pope Alexander VI, who was a contemporary of what he was writing. And it's like, well, he only knew what he knew. That's what he was writing. And again, it was fine. Although the interesting thing in his book, where he touches on Pope Alexander VI, he mentions, it's something, I haven't read it for years, but there's something, it stuck in my mind though. And it was, there were stories about how immoral and such this Pope was. However, it is important to note that he never taught heresy. That's the Catholic mindset. So he said it's important to note that he never taught heresy. Minor mention, so to speak, in that book.
Yeah.
Big mentions in this book. He doesn't talk about heresy. I like it. That's not part of.
He doesn't care.
He's writing about the moral side of it. So that's because that's a Catholic historian who has the important things right. Yeah, maybe he's terrible. Maybe he's fine, but he didn't teach heresy. That's the important things. But I would say, a level of skepticism and interest, and just not getting overwhelmed. Some people go, "Oh, I want to learn about history, so I'm going to get in. What's a list of books I should read?" It's like, well, what do you want to learn about? Like, you've got the world to read about. Like, what's your interest? Maybe it's not what I've read recently, but some people, it's like, oh, I need to learn about Catholic history. Year 1, 2, 3, and then they'll go through. They'll try and find everything that happened every year. But it's like it's too much, and the good thing is that the more people who have different interests and read about it, the more they can all talk about different parts. And people go through phases, I think, of being interested in this and being interested in that. And you're never going to know everything. And you're never going to be absolutely sure, because that's just the nature of history and historiography, is that there are so many minor things that just one record which says this could change a whole narrative, because historical narratives are built on the snippets we know, maybe big pages, whatever, and then somewhere along the line, you have to either say nothing or you have to plug in the holes with logical progression. And that happens where people will say, no one's talked about this, but we can assume that based on this that we know and this that we know, this something like this happened in between. And that's honest scholarship. And that's, I think, lacking in a lot of history textbooks. That's, I think, the problem is it goes back to school. Even modern Catholic history textbooks, again, some of them can fall into the opposite side of being too apologetic, and every Catholic's amazing and no one's ever done anything wrong. But I think textbooks present a story for children, arguably at varying ages, but they present it as so factual that people think that, again, especially in the modern world, in the modern entertainment world, people think that history is like a movie but more boring, or it's like a book but worse written, like that sort of thing. And it's like, but it's not. Is that there are different people who write about things and they argue with each other. Historians argue with each other about, well, what about that and what about this and blah blah blah. It's a whole, it's a vibrant like network which has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years of people writing about their experiences, what they saw, and then writing about what their friends saw, or that sort of thing. And it's just hard. And there are times in history which are very, very difficult because of a lack of people writing. One thing interesting, I'll probably should finish on this, but one thing interesting is when the Spanish first went to mainland America with Cortez, of the however many, 150 or whatever conquistadors that landed, I think, actually, I don't know off the top of my head, but three of them were writers, and they wrote down what happened, right? This is like insane. One of them was the guy himself, the man himself, Cortez, right? He was writing what happened. You got to take that with a grain of salt, because in his story, Cortez was such a legend, right? But yeah. So, but then other times, interestingly, in the exact same place, if you look at the story of the first Cristero War in Mexico, the Cristeros were made up generally of peasantry and rural people, and they were very busy. It was a very difficult and full time for conflict. Very few of them, in fact, I don't think any one of them, and I don't think any one of those people who fought for the Cristeros actually was an author who wrote down what happened. The Cristero leadership were all killed within a year after the peace was signed. Keep that in mind. So the Cristero leadership were all killed. That's 500 of them within a couple of years. 5,000 of the Cristero fighters were just killed in the next 5 years or 10 years. So these people were hunted down. They didn't have time to write their own story. And so there's so much stuff where when you're looking through it, it's like people talking about it, they're trying to put stuff together, but they just don't know, because the Mexican government wasn't very interested in telling the truth at that point, and the Catholics weren't talking because they were too busy being dead. So like there's all sorts of things like that where it's just it's a skepticism is necessary. And I don't want to be too overwhelming to people like, oh my gosh, what can I trust? It's like, well, the church, start there, but or the faith and Catholicism, but it's all interesting. Like, you can't get too obsessed with stuff. It's like, it's a matter of interest. It should be fun. It's actually, it should be something you're interested in and you like doing. If you're torturing yourself trying to learn about history, you're not doing it right, because that's not the point. Like, it's not meant to be a chore. And I think that's, again, leading back, that's the problem with what history became in the modern schooling system, which wasn't designed, arguably, to make smart people who could think for themselves. That's not what it was designed for. It wasn't even designed for people to make people be able to read particularly well. But it was, so basically that process was, here's the story, believe it, be bored, please. If you're crazy, you'll study history in university, and then you'll know even less. I've never studied in history at university, so I don't know. Maybe it's better there, depending on the course or the country. But it's not meant to be problematic for you. And again, if you're not that interested in it, you don't have to go look. But it's worth just keeping in mind that if someone tells you, hey, did you hear that the Crusaders did this? Did you hear that Pope such and such did this? Maybe he didn't. Maybe they didn't. Where did he
There's
read?
A lot of YouTube videos, I think, going around, even by seculars, on the real story of the Crusaders, and saying
Yeah.
and on the whole, they actually were solving problems. Like, they weren't
The
these.
interesting thing is that, yeah, exactly. The internet actually caused the biggest dent in historical narratives in the English language ever. And I think that's probably as the internet gets better and better, that's going to be more interesting. And I think one of the big things as well, obviously people have different opinions on AI, for instance. And again, there are different types and different ones and different ways of using them. But one thing which can be useful about it, I would say, is the ability to actually not scrutinize, because that's always your job. A human is never absolved from their responsibility. Like, just if you're Googling stuff, it's like, yeah, but it said so. No, you have to be discerning. But I think AI can hit you with 100 different sources of people and arguments which have been going on for hundreds of years. And you can say, oh, this is actually what people are actually arguing about. This no one knows yet, but what makes sense? And then that's sort of a thing. It can be a huge rabbit hole. So, plan your life accordingly. But yeah, the internet caused the biggest dent, I would say, because it undermined the establishment narrative, if that makes sense, or the concept of the establishment narrative, which has been a huge problem in heavy propaganda nations, such as especially Protestant nations going back. They were the masters of it. And
sorry, keep going.
No, but yeah, it's just all about what the individual is interested in. It's about what you're interested in and what you like learning about. Maybe you like learning about, maybe you like ships. You like wooden sailing ships. Well, then go look at what was going on in the 1700s, what they were building there. That's pretty cool. Maybe you watch Pirates of the Caribbean and you're interested in that. Just random things like that. You can be interested in and just learn. That's actually, and in fact, that's normally that's the big lead in oftentimes for things that I research. I call it research. But it's like someone will say something, or I'll see something there, or I'll think, well, where did that come from? What's that about? What happened there? You watch a movie, you play a game or whatever. It's like, oh, well, what happened there? Did that actually happen? And you might be surprised. You might surprise yourself just by doing a quick Google search and finding out, oh, that's an interesting story. You don't need to spend the next 5 hours reading every single interesting story you can find. Just read one thing and then talk about it with someone else. And as soon as you bring it up with someone else, they might say, oh, actually, that's not what happened. That's not what happened because of this. And you're like,
that's my life. I'm like, oh yeah, so yeah, I was reading about this and this and that. Yeah, well, actually, if you look at this, so yeah, here we go. Well, thank you, Jana. We've got some comments. We'll just quickly go through them and we'll wrap this up. Crusader Filmworks, thank you again. The question is, what are your thoughts on pursuing a degree in history? My channel is centered on the study and presentation of Catholic military history. I've debated pursuing a degree in military history. First thing I would say is probably that we haven't got degrees in history.
We don't.
Things like that's a
well, you have a
personal
degree.
choice. But not.
You're the only one who has a degree. I don't even.
Yeah, and I've finally paid off the debt mostly. After years and years and years. What I would say is Crusader Filmworks. We actually do have TR lives in the past on this channel, specifically about business and careers, and we sort of talk about some food for thought. I think those will be more appropriate for you, and then of course, it's your life. So hopefully, that content is useful for you. We have here from Mundus Verus. Many people believe the American Revolution was fought over 3% tax on tea. 3% tax? Gee, that sounds like a dream. Good grief. Oh my gosh. However, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography explains that the primary cause was the suppression of colonial currency. Chan, did you want to make any comment at this stage?
I would say it's interesting. And again, Benjamin Franklin was one of the guys.
Sorry, Chan, I just moved on. There's a follow-up. Sorry, I'll move on. It is almost as if prevailing narratives seek to diminish the founding fathers, portraying them as irrational figures willing to risk their lives over a trivial tax on tea. Now,
I'll say, so first of all, there was someone who made a very interesting comment, not recently, and he said, America was never taxed so lightly as under the king. So the taxes were always, and again, even then, the narrative was like, even at the time and since, they qualify. It wasn't about the tax, because most people, I think, have heard the phrase "no taxation without representation." It was the idea that Americans were being undermined in British Parliament when they were quite an important part of the British Empire at the time, and they thought, well, we want to actually have an influence. And even if there was no tea, then it might not have. There would have still been problems. I would say again, Benjamin Franklin is one of the guys. There were a lot of different people involved. One of the founding fathers was I think he was a Catholic who became the first Archbishop of America, I think. Again, you'd probably be better off talking to Bishop Sanborn about him. Bishop Sanborn, I don't think, has a very high opinion of Benjamin Franklin from what I've seen. But one thing I will say is
Freemason, wasn't he?
yeah, I think so. But I will say in high school, my big high school research report was on the American War of Independence, not a revolution. I just say that to annoy Americans. And my view was flipped upside down. And first of all, it took me ages to write it because I was procrastinating, but that allowed me to read a lot of books about it. And what blew my mind is the first trigger that, again, this is just consensus. These are people who are very pro-American and blah, blah. The trigger and the saying was the American colonists, no offense, these Protestant colonists said, how can we, very loose quote, how can we feel safe and free when Catholics are beginning to be given the same rights in the empire as us? So the trigger was in the war, which the American colonists actually had helped very much against Canada, against the French in Canada, which resulted in Canada joining the British Empire. The British found themselves in a unique scenario where they had inherited a huge amount of territory with a huge number of Catholics. And so the British had a standing rule similar to the what do you call it? Similar to the Spanish. The Spanish had theirs about Protestantism. The British had one about Catholicism. They very much didn't like it, and they were trying very hard to keep it down. When they inherited Canada, they knew that they could not force the French Canadians to give up Catholicism. They knew that would cause problems throughout the whole world. It would be regarded as a persecution in a way beyond what had happened in England, and the French would hate it because they were French Canadian people. And so for the first time ever, the king at the time and through the parliament, I don't know the exact process, granted freedom of religion to the Catholics, to the Quebecois, or however you say it, to the Catholics in French Canada. And the American colonists who had spent however many 100 years, I don't know how long they'd been there at this point, they had spent a long time very much promoting and supporting Protestantism through the colonies. There was a Catholic colony called Maryland. Many people have heard of it. I'm pretty sure that was the Catholic colony, which allowed freedom of religion and eventually got taken over by Puritans, and then Catholicism was banned. So they were getting a stranglehold of Protestantism in the Americas. The first people were triggered by the fear that freedom of religion for Catholics would go down into the colonies. That was the first people. The interesting thing to keep in mind is that the very first people who were there at the start of the War of Independence weren't very much around by the end of it. So it's a very long, I don't know off the top of my head how long it lasted, but it's an example of a political situation where it's not a one-track, the trigger didn't lead to the result. Arguably, because the founding fathers did put in freedom of religion, which most Protestants didn't believe in, actually, at the beginning of the war. But I would say there's a big compound of things which all get together. And I don't know, obviously, there might be one thing that was bigger than others. One of them was the quartering of British troops. Many people have probably heard of that. The idea that British troops could just knock on your door and say, hey, guy, I know you've got a family with, kids. Can myself and 10 soldiers just sleep in here? Thank you. And they just had to let them. That was, maybe someone can correct me on the details of how that was supposed to work. But there were just all kinds of things that the Americans weren't liking. And it depended on who it was. Different people had different things they didn't like. Like a number of the founding fathers wrote retroactively to interpret the Constitution. For instance, you've got the Federalist Papers, things like that. And the problem is that there, however many people there were, I forget off the top of my head how many people there were, how many of the founding fathers there were. But they're all different people, and they're all individuals. They're all allowed to have their own motivations and their reasons for things. All we know is that they went into whatever building and they locked themselves in and they shut the curtains and they sat around until the Constitution was written. And whatever the process of them finding consensus was. But through that, there's a lot of people involved who all have their own, probably all have their own version of why, of what they think was the best reason for the War of Independence. And again, then there's that, and then there's what they tell the average person to try and convince them. Because again, the American War of Independence was fought between a large number of American colonists against a large number of American colonists who were loyal to the British Crown. That's not uncommon for wars of independence. So some of them weren't convinced, and some of them were, for whatever reason, for whatever appealed to them. It's a bit, I mean, it's long and it's ranty, but I think that kind of sums up that there's almost no, it's hard to get a one phrase summary of anything. It's all just interesting. And again, all of them can be true at the same time. Maybe Benjamin Franklin said that. Maybe all of them thought that.
You can also have multiple reasons for something. That's the thing.
Yeah, there's multiple reasons.
Like,
and then
yeah.
Well, yeah, there's multiple reasons, and then there's what you tell the average person who you're trying to convince.
Yeah, if there's multiple reasons, the reasons that you feel will be the most persuasive to get buy-in is what you use. That's just smart. Do we need to wrap this up? I have got a question from my wife on Telegram. Have you finished yet? ? That generally is a loaded question. So what I'll quickly do, let's go through some more comments. I might not be able to get through all of them. We've got one from Fear of God Always. Are you familiar with Raymond Ibrahim? His work on the Crusades has been particularly insightful and accurate. I personally am not. Chana, are you?
I've not heard of him. Again, we should probably write that down.
It's recorded on YouTube. You can come back to it.
Yeah. Now, I've not heard of him myself, so I can't comment. I don't know what he's said. But there's a lot of people I don't know what era he's from. Sounds somewhat contemporary.
Yeah.
But a lot of people in the last however long have had a lot of, again, insightful and accurate writings on the Crusades. Because again, Protestants hated the Crusades. That's the thing, is that it was their perfect example of what they could harp on. The Catholics would go to war against, but you actually find a lot of political reasons for why the Crusades happened. It's like, that you can, both things can be true. You can want to be a good Catholic and you want to do Catholic things. And you can also say, but at the same time, we don't like having this political play or whatever. And that's acceptable in the geopolitics of the time. So, something to look into, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We've got some more comments. Mundus Verus. I'm going to read them out, and at the end, if Alexander has comments, sure. If not, we'll move on. But thank you for the comments, so I'll read them out. This is regarding the previous conversation around the Founding Fathers and the American Revolution, War of Independence. But one must ask the question, why are these reasons for the revolution buried? Elites tend to despise anyone who rebels. There's two more follow-ups. Yes, Benjamin Franklin was not a moral man, but he was rightly angered by the establishment of a centralized bank, something we are unfortunately still plagued with today. Final comment. Quote, the bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. That was Andrew Jackson to Martin Van Buren on the Second Bank of the United States. Alexander, anything else to add on what you said before? Do you want to make any more comments on these three comments?
Well, I'm not familiar with these myself particularly. Again, reasons for something to be buried, there's always a reason. Someone's got a motive. That's the important thing, especially because America is now a continuous institution. They there are people on every side of whatever political spectrum who have an interest in their own political perspective, and for whatever reason, they all have a motive in controlling the narrative of what it was. That doesn't mean any of them are right or wrong. And I think one thing I will say as well is, morally speaking, the Catholic Church also frowns very highly on people who rebel without a extremely good reason and a long process leading up to it, a process which is actually so long and complicated that normally it stops before it even happens. So there is that. However, again, there's different geopolitics of different times. I would say, though, actually, it seems like the elites love people who rebel. Almost every single country now is formed on a rebellion, and those were the rebellions that put those elites in. So it's not that elites dislike rebellion; it's that they dislike a rebellion that'll displace what their rebellion achieved.
They don't want to rebellion to their rebellion.
No, yeah.
I mean,
So that's the thing. Every revolution or rebellion was a displacement of one elite class who pushed out the other elite class. I didn't make that up. That there was some historian who wrote that. That was his perspective. If you want to find that quote, you can quote him on that. Don't quote me.
Very good. And Mundus Vera says, "Thank you for the good episode and engaging with my many comments. Not a problem, and thank you very much."
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
The comments. We've got a few more. Fear of God always. Let me ask you this: are you looking forward to any upcoming historical films like Young Washington? In general, I really don't look forward to films because they might put something dodgy, and then I go, well, that's not something I can watch. But no, I don't have any in my mind. But Chana, do you have any?
Not off the top of my head. I don't keep up with it. I normally hear about them from people who rave about them afterwards, and then I watch them and don't like them. No, I'm joking. I would say films are interesting, sometimes informative, but and fun, that entertaining. That if it's good, it's worth it. If it comes out and it's good, I look forward to watching it. But again, there's one thing to keep in mind is that I would watch a historical movie and I would take notes in my mind, so to speak, and I would say, well, what did that happen, or was that licensed for the sake of the film, the good of the film, by the power vested in the plot, that sort of thing. And so those are examples of good staging grounds where you watch it, you think, oh, that was interesting. Did that actually happen? You read it, and then you're like, oh, there's an argument about what actually happened. Did that happen there, or how did it happen? That's the sort of thing. So I would say people shouldn't base their entire historical argument on what they saw in a movie. Absolutely, you can talk about a movie and watch a movie. I will say, even though I mentioned writing a research report on American history, my interest in American history is not prolific enough for me to go down that rabbit hole regularly, especially at different times. I'm at a different time of my life now. If someone hits me with something interesting enough, I'll absolutely watch it and look at it. I mean, it's all interesting to me, but not enough for me to have a read or watch list. But now that you've mentioned it, it's going to be in my mind. So I'll probably
They've created the open loop
and see if it comes out.
He can't resist himself. He has to find the answer or potential answers. No, good. Crusader Filmworks again. Thank you for the comment, Raymond. You are referring to Raymond Ibrahim, the author who has done work on Crusades. I don't know if he's an author, I should say. His work, I don't know what that is. Raymond is alive and currently writing books on it. Well, I should have read the full comment.
He is an author. Yeah.
He is an author.
That's interesting.
And Crusader Filmworks again. Our federal government has so many issues, it's not even funny. So
don't worry, it's not. You're not unique.
Yeah. 3% tax. I'm still trying to get over that. Sounds amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Chana, thank you very much for being on this show. I found it very enjoyable. I think the audience did as well. We got a lot of comments. Again, audience, please thumbs up, subscribe, and all that good stuff. But more importantly for yourselves, if you like this content and you want to see more of it, put it in the comments because that will drive the content and the topics on these live streams. Alexander, anything to finish off with before we close out?
No, I think I've said enough actually. Yeah, no.
Thank
Well, thank you
goodness.
to everyone who
Honestly.
found it interesting. I hope there was something that made someone interested enough to think, oh, maybe I'll look at that. Again, not everything is for everyone, but most people don't realize what they're interested in sometimes until it comes up. So I hope people found something interesting, and I think it's a good effort for people who stayed for as long as they did. And hopefully you found it interesting, although you've probably heard a lot of this sort of stuff before sometime.
No, it was good. No, thank you very much. And my final request: if anyone can prove Alexander wrong, but actually, with
Yeah,
substantive
something.
evidence, please put in the comments, because anything that disproves what he said, I will screenshot and send to him with a lot of
Bring the
joy.
receipts. We'll have to do a
Yeah.
retractive episode.
Yeah.
But that's
Thank you, everyone.
history. All right.
Yeah, that's it. See you later. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.